Guys, have you ever been stressed out? Oh my gosh, I think it's the one thing we all have in common. If you're living this life, you've had at least one, two, maybe multiple stressful experiences. So today we're going to talk about exactly that. What is the impact of stress and anxiety on the unborn child? We're going to talk about it. You'll be surprised at the things we're finding out. Stay tuned. So you guys are probably wondering, what is up with the whole Zen situation? Because we're going to talk about stress. I want to make sure you guys aren't stressed out. Okay. So I decided to do a little bit of a different setting just for today, just to send you some Zen vibes, some calming vibes. So let's start with fetal programming. Have you ever heard of fetal programming? Well, fetal programming or prenatal programming is the concept that suggests that certain events occurring at very critical times during the pregnancy actually has permanent effects on the fetus and the infant long after birth. So if we think about stressful events that occurred in our lifetime, most of us can probably agree that the one very stressful event that we all have in common, at least in the US, is 9/11. So let's talk about it. So since 9/11, we've heard about the long-term effects of the exposure of toxins and the event itself and the emotional and physical health of our first responders. Salute to our first responders always. We've heard about those who were witnesses or survivors of the event, and we have been following them, right? One of the things I thought would be interesting to do would be to find out what happened to the women who were pregnant at the time of 9/11. So what we do know is at least 530,000 New York, let's say that number again, 530,000 New York City residents suffered from some symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. They found that there has been at least 1,700 women who were pregnant at the time of 9/11, meaning they were either nearby or actually at the site of the Twin Towers. So there has been studies looking at the long-term effect of all the survivors of 9/11. The Traumatic Stress Studies Division at Mount Sinai Medical Center, now known as ICANN, renamed my alma mater, shout out to you guys, have done incredible work in this particular area. And one doctor in particular, Dr. Rachel Yehuda, and I hope I am not destroying your name, Dr. Yehuda, but she has done incredible work as a professor of psychiatry and neuroscience who has been in charge of this division. She set out to really look at the experiences of these women and to look at the outcomes in their children. So there are about 38 women who enrolled in her study who were pregnant at the time of 9/11 and were either at or nearby the World Trade Center at the time of their attack, some of which later went on to develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So let's talk about the impact of stress on the body. Well, we know one of the hormones that's released at the time that we're stressed out is our stress hormone called cortisol. So this particular study that looked at the pregnant women looked at the level of the cortisol levels in women who develop post-traumatic stress disorder and the level in their child. The women who develop post-traumatic stress disorder following the attack were noted to have significantly lower levels of cortisol in their saliva. And then a year later, the researchers measured the cortisol level in the children and found the same. So the children who were born to the women who had developed post-traumatic stress disorder had lower levels of hormone than other children who were also exposed. So looking at this study showed that the moms who had post-traumatic stress disorder had lower cortisol levels, and so did their children. What's interesting is that this particular finding was also more pronounced in women who were in the third trimester at the time that they were exposed to the attack. What we do also know is that these kids also exhibit increased distress response when they are stimulated by something that's totally normal. And this particular finding was pronounced again in the second now trimester as well as the third trimester. So Dr. Yehuda pretty much established that women who are pregnant and undergo traumatic experiences can leave this epigenetic mark that alters the way their children respond to stress. Really interesting. So where are we going with this? So there was a small cohort study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, also known as JAMA, that showed that the fetus of a mom with anxiety was more likely to have two things. They had weaker connections between the two areas of the brain that were involved in executive and higher cognitive function, but stronger connection between parts of the brain that connected to emotions and behavior. So the exposure to anxiety in the mom downregulated cognitive functions like higher level cognitive functions and upregulated emotional and behavioral areas in the brain. Really interesting, right? So when we look at maternal stress, there are a couple of things that we do know. Going back to the cohort of women who were pregnant at the time of 9/11, those who were pregnant in the first trimester were more likely to have shorter durations of their pregnancy. We also know that maternal stress correlates with increased infant mortality, low birth weight, preterm delivery up to 25 to 60%. You guys, that's incredible. Poor nutrition and increased toxic habits. Kind of makes sense, right? Like if you're stressed out, what do we all tend to do, or a lot of us tend to do? We emotionally eat. We either decrease our appetite or we increase our appetite, but ultimately we're not eating healthy. We're not taking in sufficient nutrition. And we're more likely to pick up toxic habits in a response to try to relieve the stress. They also found, what was interesting is that they've also found that there's an association between maternal stress and congenital defects, specifically heart defects, right? Really interesting. Maternal bereavement, even if it occurred during the preconception time period, months before conception, and certainly throughout the prenatal time period, was associated with childhood obesity and overweight. Maternal stress has also been associated with autism-like characteristics, especially when the exposure occurs in the first trimester. So what does this all mean? Maternal stress has a strong influence on the development of the child. So think about it. For those moms who are watching this video, were you stressed out during your pregnancy? Do you notice any type of behavioral outcomes in your child? Think about that for a moment, but let's talk about it a little bit more. So what's the mechanism of the transference of maternal anxiety to the child? Great question. We don't quite really understand how this happens. But what we do know is that infants really depend on parents to help regulate their own psychological arousal, right? So what are sources of maternal stress? Anxiety and depression is probably one of the most common mental health disorders that we are familiar with. That certainly is an example of a mental health disorder that tends to be correlated with a higher level of stress. Certainly if someone has a traumatic life event, we just talked about 9/11 as being an example. So we also just talked about maternal bereavement and its impact. And it's not just the loss of a loved one. You can have significant grieving and loss that's not related to necessarily the loss of a person, but could be the loss of health. It could be the loss of finances, such as a very severe financial devastation. It can be the loss of security of some sort. So certainly the grieving process and significant bereavement can also be a source of maternal stress. And then also encountering dangers, natural disasters like, oh my gosh, global warming. Can we talk about it? The floods, the fires, all those events. If a mom is pregnant and she has those experiences, she is more likely to have a higher level of maternal stress. Stress alters the way we regulate internally. And stress is also intended to be short-term, right? But how many of us are living lives where we can't really say that stress is necessarily short-term? So one of the dangers of stress is to have chronic exposures of stress. And that has certainly become, unfortunately, the norm in many of our lives. So whatever stress event you have, you want to be able to respond to it in such a way that's healthy so that the effects of the stress doesn't become a chronic or long-term event. So what do we know? We know that if mom is stressed out and her cortisol levels is elevated, then the cortisol levels of her child will also be elevated. And also the child may also have increased cortisol reactivity. Now you're probably saying, but Dr. T, didn't you just say that their cortisol levels were low in the 9/11 group? Yes, I did. But what we have to keep in mind was that it was a very specific cohort that the study followed. It was specifically following women who were exposed to 9/11, developed post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's the cohort that they were studying. This was not a general study that looked at all women who had the exposure of stress. But the general response to stress is that our cortisol level will increase. So what does this increased cortisol level and increased cortisol reactivity do in the child? Well, certainly we have been finding strong research to indicate that there's developmental risk, specifically cognitive development, social emotional problems, more difficult temperament in the offspring, emotional stress and anxiety, higher reaction intensity. We talked about that upregulation in the study in the JAMA, higher behavioral problems, and these effects can last up until adolescence, some studies are showing. So maternal anxiety increases the anxiety of her offspring. So why does maternal anxiety increase the risk of anxiety in her offspring? Well, there are a couple of things that we can already kind of presume, right? So moms who are anxious are less likely to have maternal interaction behavior. They're more likely to speak in a more anxious tone and less likely to have positive tone. Moms who are stressed out are less likely to smile or less likely to play or have times when they imitate their child like most moms do. Moms who are stressed out are also more likely to have anxious facial expressions, probably like my facial expression right now. Just kidding. But certainly there are certain cues that even an infant can pick up on that are very much nonverbal cues, but is certainly expressive of a mom that is in an anxious mindset, okay? So what are some of the outcomes? Well, when we look at these kids of moms who are anxious, we know that the babies have less positive affect, they are more withdrawn, and they cry more frequently and have increased signs of stress during interactions. So why is this all important? Like, who are we talking about? Who may be at risk for these types of outcomes? And granted, there is still lots of studying that we still need to do, but the reason why this is even more important is the fact that we have groups of people who have really severe and tragic life events who may be at risk of having these particular outcomes in their child and really should at least be aware that this may be a potential problem. So certainly children of combat veterans, salute to all our vets who put their lives on the line, but those who have been in combat have had traumatic experiences. And this can be a potential risk to their offspring. Children of people who had major humanitarian tragedies like the Holocaust, children who are born to moms who live in gang-infested communities, victims of domestic violence, and certainly more recently, the most applicable group of women where this really is important for us to put more research in is the bad maternal outcome of Black women. So one of the most consistent, or I would say probably the most consistent factor that seems to be correlated with the severe increase in maternal mortality in Black women is chronic stress related to racism, specifically African American Black women. So there's need for just a tremendous amount of research in this particular area. And at least we are now starting to acknowledge not just the physiological health of moms, but also the mental health of moms and the physical outcomes on the onboard child. Some of you may be familiar with neuroplasticity. So what does neuroplasticity say? Well,